Okay, I will keep going. So I'll just finish off this housing lecture and then we'll move on to reproduction. So I'll share. Okay, so talking about outdoor and free range production. So often when you think about outdoor pig production, you might have this sort of image in your mind, but in reality, it probably looks more like this. So less green, lush green paddocks and more sort of brown surface that looks a little bit like the moon. So pigs will obviously dig up and destroy most of the ground that they're being housed on, because that's who they are. So this is a picture of a farrowing paddock. So the way that they're kept in the paddock is via these fences, which are electric. And then you'll see here some farrowing huts. And then we also have to have a wallow. There will be a feeder somewhere in that paddock for the sows to go and eat ad libitum. If this was a gestation paddock where the sows have to be restrict fed, then every morning a feed truck would come around and blow feed into the paddock for the sows to limit their ration. So yes, some more pictures there. As I said, dry sows are fed by a blower over the fence, and that encourages foraging behaviour. There's feeders for progeny pigs. So when we're growing weaners, growers, finishers in outdoor paddocks, they'll have feeders because you obviously want them to have ad libitum feed. For the farrowing huts, there's a fender or a little wall in front of the hut which prevents the piglets from going out. So that'll stay up for the first 7 to 10 days and then get opened up to allow the piglets to come out. You have to offer a wallow. You have to obviously offer drinker troughs, and then it's usually electric fencing. Now, so you may see these kind of labels: certified free range, certified outdoor bred raised on straw. So another common scenario is to have your breeding herd raised outdoors, but then you raise your progeny in eco shelters. So that explains that label there. So this is what a farrowing hut looks like. And this is the little fender that will be up there stopping the piglets from getting out. So that gets removed after the first 7 to 10 days. The pros of outdoor is that it obviously allows the sows to express maternal behaviours. That nest building increases oxytocin, prolactin, and colostrum. So all those sort of reproductive pregnancy hormones. It promotes natural foraging behaviours, which the pigs obviously love to do. Lots of social interaction. You get robust piglets, and it sits well with the public. The disadvantages of outdoor free range is predation is a major issue. So mostly issue with foxes taking piglets. You get a really big increase in pre-weaning mortality. So as I said, using farrowing crates, we can achieve a pre-weaning mortality of 5 to 10%. In outdoor production, it goes up to 15, 20%. In extreme weather, so I know of one farm when they had really high spike in summer heat, they had a pre-weaning mortality of up to 40% through those weeks. So, and remember, pigs are cold climate animals, so keeping them outdoors in Australia certainly does come with challenges, particularly in the summer around sunburn and pre-weaning mortality and keeping the sows comfortable. So there's also a lot of environmental regulation and responsibility, particularly around nutrients going into the soil and the water table and where you house the pigs. So if you want to sell your pigs as outdoor raised, you have to move your farm every 2 years to fit with the environmental regulations, and that's obviously a really big operation. So there are some farms that might not move, and that means that, yes, even though the pigs are raised outdoors, they can't sell them as outdoor raised pigs under the APIC guidelines, which is the most common quality assurance program that producers will use. Obviously, with outdoor production, you're susceptible to the weather. You can get reduced growth rates because there are more environmental stresses. You can't farm pigs outdoors anywhere. You have to have the right soil, etc. So you are a bit limited in terms of where you can do it. Although saying that, the southwest of WA is a great location to raise pigs outdoors. And a lot of Australia's outdoor production does come from that area. And then you also have to get your wallow design right, which sounds simple but isn't. And then giving the sows appropriate shelter, all the pigs appropriate shelter as well, particularly in summer. So just a final word on Coles, who sort of seems to, I guess, promote themselves as having the highest standards in terms of animal welfare, etc. So in 2010, Coles said that the pork brand would be completely sow stall free by 2014, so earlier than what the industry had planned. And obviously they also had their own definition of what sow stall free was. The problem is that Coles were obviously still selling ham and bacon that's been imported from other countries that don't necessarily have the same standards of being sow stall free. So then APL accused Coles of saying that they had double standards. So now when you buy Coles brand pork or ham or bacon, it has to go by the same standard in terms of their definition of sow stall free. But if you're buying non-Coles brand imported ham or bacon, then that necessarily isn't sow stall free. So just something to be aware of, I guess, when all this marketing hoo-ha comes out, points to consider. So another thing about Coles is that they did originally not accept pigs that had Improvac, but now they've changed their mind and they do accept pigs that have been given Improvac. So remember, that's our immunocastration vaccine. And then ractopamine is still not permitted. And we'll talk about ractopamine in our meat quality lecture. Okay, so I'll just quickly change over. Into reproduction. Okay, hopefully that is still, yep, that's sharing now. Okay, so these are our learning objectives for reproduction. Okay, so when we're thinking about the events in the life of a breeding female pig, this is our little timeline. So very far to the left of this timeline, our female pigs are being born and raised on farm. If they have not been selected for breeding, then they will go as progeny pigs to the abattoir at around 5 to 5.5 months. If they are going to be kept on farm for breeding, then they will start to go through puberty at around 25 to 28 weeks of age. So if we are getting pigs in on the farm from another source, then around that 6-month mark is when we will be bringing them on farm. So the sow, or the gilts I should say, will come into puberty. We skip their first heat, and so their first mating will happen when they're around 30 to 34 weeks of age. They'll go through their first pregnancy, and then they'll get weaned, and then they will start the cycle of mating, pregnancy, lactation, weaning, and then and repeat. So this is just another way of demonstrating that timeline. So once we get into this cycle of mating, pregnancy, weaning, etc., the sows will normally have around 6 to 7 litters or cycles, and then they'll get to the stage where their reproductive performance starts to decrease, and they'll go as cull sows to the abattoir. So normally around after parity 6 is when we'll start to see a decline in reproductive performance. So we're going to start with puberty though, and talk about the different stages of this diagram through the lecture. So gilts are probably our most challenging group in terms of the breeding herd on farm. They are hard to breed, they farrow fewer piglets, they require special feeding because they're still growing, so they're not fully mature when they have their first pregnancy. So therefore you do need to feed them a different diet to accommodate for that. They sometimes require different housing because you obviously can't house them with really old sows because of the risk of bullying. They require closer observation, and if you're buying them in from another farm as replacement gilts from a multiplier farm, then they pose a risk of disease. So, but saying that, they are necessary to have on farm to keep the breeding herd replenished and young. So the normal ratio is about 80% sows to 20% gilts. So just sort of going on from that, there are poorest performance on farm. So they're still growing when they're mated at 30 to 34 weeks. The litter weights are lighter. Their colostrum and milk production is lower because their mammary glands are still developing. So therefore their piglets have the highest pre-weaning mortality, and they have lighter weaning weights, and they can take longer to come into heat once they have been weaned. So if we think about lactation, that's quite an energy demanding process. If you're a young gilt, then that can probably knock you a bit more than if you're an older sow. So therefore the body will not start ovulating or going into estrus until it's ready to do so from a biological point of view. So if the gilts really get I guess if they lose a lot of condition in lactation, then it can take a bit of extra time for them to build up those energy stores before the body's ready to get pregnant again. So these are our 6 golden rules for managing gilts, because often they can be a shortfall from a reproduction point of view on farms. Producers might struggle a little bit with their gilts. So when we bring our gilts on farm, or we've selected them for breeding, to accelerate puberty, we really want to be giving them daily boar contact to bring on their first heat quicker. So the way that we do daily boar contact is either a boar goes in and lives with the gilts, Now, that's probably not very practical because you obviously don't want that boar mating with the gilts because you don't want them to get pregnant in their first heat. So what often happens is that you might house a vasectomized boar in with the gilts, so they get full physical contact with the boar, but there's no risk of pregnancy. Another option is that every morning before you go into the mating shed to do your matings, you bring the boar that you're going to use for your matings in front of where the gilts are being housed, and they have nose-to-nose contact through the gate. So that's another way of doing daily boar contact. Obviously, that's not as good because they're not getting full physical contact, and if it's quite a large pen, then some gilts might miss out on their bore contact. Then we skip the first heat, but we mark them to say, yes, they've come into heat at this time. And then 21 days later, on their second heat, we will mate them. So they'll be around 30 weeks of age, which is in line with our rule of 3. So just think for the top one, 27 weeks, for their first heat, and then 30 weeks for their second heat. So weight at their first mating is very important. So you want them to be around 150 kilos live weight, so not below 130, not above 160. If they are going to be part of an indoor production system and most likely exposed to a sow stall, then you want to train them in the sow stall first before you put them in there, because that can be a bit of a stressful scenario for them. And then once you mate them, you leave them alone. So low stress is really the key in terms of managing our gilts. Something to keep in mind, so this is a graph that shows parity on the x-axis and total born on the y-axis. And really the main point about this is that the lines don't cross. So if you have a gilt that has a low total born, so this orange line here, she's going to perform that way for her whole reproductive life. So yes, she will increase a little bit when she gets up to parity 3, etc., because that's her most reproductive phase, but she's never going to be a top performer. Versus a gilt that has a high litter first go, she'll probably maintain that through her reproductive life. So it's, I guess, important to identify these gilts up here. Okay, so that's puberty and managing our gilts. So now we will go on to the mating section of this lecture. So before we do that, we need to review our anatomy because it's a bit different to our chicken anatomy. So obviously in the sow, we have our vagina and our cervix, which then goes into the uterine body. So each uterine horn is about 1.5 meters long. We then have our oviduct and our ovaries there. And then that's just the side view, but pretty straightforward in a female. So the sow cycle is 21 days. So rule of 3. So every 21 days, a sow will ovulate and come into heat. So a sow at an ovulation will produce around 23 eggs, and a gilt will produce around 20 eggs. So that's why our gilt litter numbers are lower, because they simply don't ovulate as many eggs. Eggs will begin to die within 8 to 12 hours after ovulation. Sperm, on the other hand, will survive for 24 hours. So not as good as our chicken sperm. Remember, that could survive for weeks in the chicken reproductive tract, but our boar sperm will only survive for 24 hours. Saying that, it also needs to navigate its way up into the oviduct. So if you just think it's got to swim all the way up here, get through this 1.5 meters of uterine body, and then get up into the oviduct here, It's got a long way to go. And it also needs to sit up there for about 6 to 8 hours to develop fully before it can fertilize the eggs. So therefore, with that in mind, it's better to have the sperm sitting there in the reproductive tract ready to go before ovulation occurs. And the best time for fertilization is 6 hours after ovulation, but obviously it's difficult to achieve that kind of precision. So when does a sow ovulate? So if we think about our follicles with the growing, with the eggs inside, as the follicle grows and matures, it starts to release hormones such as estrogen. And that estrogen is going to have an effect on the sow's behavior. So as that increases, then she'll start to demonstrate behaviors associated with heat. A sow's heat will last about 2 to 3 days. So normally 56 hours, I guess, on average. And ovulation will occur 70% of the time through that standing heat. So this is just a bit of a review on the ovary. So if we start down here, we have our primary follicles, and they increase in size over time. As they increase in size, they're going to start producing estrogen, which is going to affect the sow's behavior. So obviously this is just looking at one ovum being released, but remember with the sow, she's going to be releasing 23 eggs at one ovulation. Once the eggs get released, then the follicle turns into a structure called the corpus luteum, and this is the structure, if a pregnancy is established, that will produce the progesterone. So this is what a sow ovary looks like, and you can see here that little, I guess, domey bit on the follicle is an egg about to be released. And you can see another one there, another one there, another one there, another one there. So there's quite a few. Okay, so we covered this in ANS 101, but these are the behaviours associated with that increase in estrogen in the blood. So pro-estrus, she will get nervous, easily disturbed. She'll be ridden by other sows but won't stand. She might have a mucoid discharge from the vagina and a swollen red vulva. When she's in standing heat, so that period of 56 hours where she's really receptive to being mated, she becomes more active. She'll mount other sows and stand if sows mount her. She'll have reduced appetite. She'll be obsessed with finding the boar, prick their ears up if she's a large white, and she'll allow the boar to mate her if he's around. So I said that ovulation occurs 70% of the time through the standing heat. So the question is, how do we know when a sow starts, without watching her 24/7, how do we know when a sow starts her standing heat? Well, the problem is that we don't, and therein lies the challenge of pig reproduction on farm. So to try and, I guess, get around that is we follow a few general rules of thumb that will ensure that we have our sperm in the reproductive tract ready there waiting for when the egg is ovulated. So to do that, we have twice daily heat checking. I should bring up my little picture here. So to do that, we check our pigs twice daily for heat. If we see a pig or a sow in heat, we mark her, and then we wait 12 hours before we mate her. And then we repeat that mating 12 hours later, and if we want to, we can do a third mating. The disadvantage of doing a third mating is that it obviously takes more labor and it costs more money to do that in terms of using more semen. So if we just look at this diagram here up the top, you can see the change in the vulval redness with the heat. Just before, in our pro-estrus phase, we start to see male characteristics, and then as we enter our standing heat phase, which lasts about 56 hours, ovulation will occur sort of around this point in time. So therefore, if we're mating, if we're doing 1 to 2 matings, potentially 3, then we should well and truly have our semen in there around the right timing. Oh, sorry, there's my line indicating ovulation. So this is just another picture demonstrating this. So standing estrus here, and then all the behaviours associated with it. So another thing to keep in mind with any animal, including humans, is that no female is the same. And of course, reproductive cycles will change slightly. Now, what can happen is you can have sows that come into standing heat quite early after being weaned. And if that happens, then they tend to have a longer standing heat period. So you can see here that this goes over a number of days versus a sow that comes into standing heat later after weaning, then their standing heat tends to last for a shorter amount of time. So that's just another variation to keep in mind, that if you have a sow that comes into heat quite early, I guess you can sort of think, okay, she's probably going to be in heat for a while, therefore maybe I won't mate her in 12 hours, I might do it in 24 hours because I want to still line up my timing. So my sperm is in there just before she ovulates. Okay, so now moving on to the anatomy of the boar. So we have our testicles, which produce the sperm, the epididymis, where the sperm is stored, the vas deferens, which carries the sperm once ejaculation occurs, and then we have our accessory glands, so seminal vesicles, prostate gland, bulbal urethral gland. So those glands will produce fluid that will support the sperm. And then obviously just a note to point out, with boars, they have spiral penises, which is an interesting anatomical feature. So all you ever wanted to know about boar sperm, so the volume is quite impressive, around 250 to 300 mils, and that's made up of 4 phases. So the first phase is your pre-sperm fraction. So that's got a lot of dead sperm and other bits that you don't really need. The second phase is our important sperm-rich, creamy section. Then the third phase, a little bit less sperm, looks greyish in colour. And then the fourth phase is your gel, which will get in there to sort of seal the deal, I guess, and potentially prevent other males from having a go. So sperm production takes 6 weeks in the pig, 4 weeks in the testes, 2 in the epididymis, and once again, impressive figures here in terms of ejaculation taking 5 to 20 minutes. So on farm, in terms of matings occurring, they can either occur through artificial insemination or natural mating. 90% of farms will use artificial insemination. It's an easy way to achieve genetic improvement on farm. So the farm will receive doses of semen like this. So that will include your sperm, your seminal plasma, so the fluid from those accessory glands, water, and extender. So in the extender, you'll have things like electrolytes, buffer to keep it at the right pH, and antibiotics. So obviously, to get sperm into these neat little packages, you have to collect from boars, and you can start collecting from about 6 to 7 months of age. There's around about 2.6 billion sperm per dose in these little packages. When you do receive the packages on farm, you have to turn them twice daily to make sure there's even distribution of extender. You need to store it at the right temperature, so 16 to 18 degrees. Any hotter, the sperm become too active, which reduces their shelf life, and any colder, you can start to damage the sperm. Keep it out of sunlight. It does have a limited shelf life, so normally about 3 to 4 days. You don't want it sitting there for a week. And then using it. And then if you are going to use mostly artificial insemination on farm, you still need boars to stimulate your sows, but you obviously don't need as many. So the general rule of thumb is 1 boar to every 50 sows. For natural matings used on farm, you obviously want to be quite selective about the boars that you use. In each ejaculation, you get around 28 billion sperm. So sometimes farms will use natural matings for sows that they're having trouble with in terms of getting pregnant. The rule of thumb is around 20 sows per boar if you're only using natural service on farm. And you can start using boars from 6 to 7 months of age. But it obviously takes time to train them and to get them doing what you want them to do. So there's the general rule of thumb in terms of how often to use a young boar versus an older boar. The recommendation is to rotate your boars every 2 to 3 years to avoid genetic lag, although I know that some farms get very attached to their boars and tend to keep them for longer. And if we just think back to the 2 different ways of doing our matings, so the detection mating area or bringing the boar to the sows, it's always better to bring the sow to the boar if you can, if your setup allows. So this brings us on to estrus detection in the sow. So as I said before, estrus detection is important to know when to time our matings. So we're checking our sows twice a day for signs of estrus. Once they show signs of estrus, we wait 12 hours and then we mate them for the first time. So you can either do estrus detection using the bore test or the back pressure test. So an important thing to remember about estrus detection is that when a sow is showing estrus behavior, it sort of increases and then decreases. So it's not a steady plateau from the time they start showing standing heat. Another thing that you have to remember is that they go into a refractory period. So for the full 56 hours that they're in standing heat and can be mated, they're not going to show the behavior all the time, because the behavior that they show obviously requires a lot of muscle contraction because the sow tenses up. She's sort of it takes a lot of energy, I guess, and so she'll often show the behavior for 10 minutes and then she'll go refractory for 45 minutes. So but if she has a break from the boar and then you show her the boar, that's when you're going to see that behavior. But then over time, it will become refractory. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And this is particularly important if we're bringing the boar to the sows. So if we just look at this scenario here, So for example, if we come in Monday morning and we're going to mate these sows, oh sorry, my mouse comes and goes. We're going to mate these sows in this line here. What you don't want to do is get your boar and bring him up this laneway and then start mating the sow here, because all the sows that you've walked him past, if they're in standing heat, will show the behavior. But then if you work your way down and come to here, she might have gone into the refractory phase. So you want to keep the boar as fresh as possible to the sows, for want of a better word. So you either bring your boars up around here and start up here, or you start down here and then work your way back up. But of course, it would be better to bring your sows to the boar. So that means that the boar can be sort of a surprise thing, in terms of seeing if the sow is in heat. So it's a novel thing if you bring her straight into this pen. And then also she can choose the boar that she's most interested in. Okay, so detecting estrus using the boar test. So that is essentially where you bring a boar to a sow, but you allow them to have full physical contact, and you see if she's in heat. Now that can be tricky if you want to use artificial insemination, because you then have to allow the full physical contact and then get the boar out so you can inseminate the sow. So obviously that's a bit dangerous if you want to do that. This would probably be used if you want to do natural matings. So these are the rules of the boar test. I'll let you read through them at your leisure. The other way of detecting estrus, which is a lot more practical, especially if you're using AI, is to do the back pressure test. So important to note that you still need a boar if you're using the back pressure test, but they don't have full physical contact. They just have nose-to-nose contact through the fence. So you can see in these pictures here, the boar is in front of the sows here, and then this person comes up behind the sow, puts pressure on her back. If she's not going to stand for mating, then doing that will piss her off and she'll run away. But if she is in heat, then obviously she'll allow the technician to get on top of her there. So this is how you would do it in a sow stall setup scenario. So you would have the boar at the front here, probably in front, you'd put little barriers down so you'd have him in front of 3 to 4 sows, and then you would go along, put pressure on the sow's back and see if she stands receptive to mating. So if we are going to use artificial insemination, these are the general rules that you need to follow. This is what the catheter looks like that we use for artificial insemination. So this is the tip. You can see this tip looks like a boar penis, so it's got that spiral appearance which sort of locks into the cervix. Other tips look like this, and then your bag of semen goes on the end here. So if you're going to use AI, you obviously need your sow in standing heat with nose-to-nose contact with the boar. You want a clean vulva, so you're not introducing any infection. You're not going to handle the tip of the catheter. You insert the catheter upwards, you attach the semen tube, and then you stimulate the sow. So you have to act like the boar behind the sow. So you have to rub her flanks, continue the pressure on her back, and that will tell her body, I guess, to contract her uterus, which will then suck the semen from the tube up into the reproductive tract. Now, you're doing it wrong if you have to squeeze that bag of semen into the sow. So really her reproductive tract should be doing all the work in terms of sucking it into the tract. So then you leave the catheter in for 5 to 10 minutes post-mating, and then you usually leave the sow for another 5 to 10 minutes just to let things settle in. So obviously if you're doing it in this scenario, you can make one sow, leave the catheter in, go to the next sow, and then come back, take the catheter out, and obviously you don't need to move the sow. If we're using this sort of scenario where we're leaving sows in here, then obviously that takes a little bit more time to move sows in and out. So I guess that's the disadvantage of this setup. Okay, so then we move on to the pregnancy bit. So this is just some basic embryology. So obviously day 0 is ovulation and fertilization. Day 2 is when, if you have fertilization, the embryos will come down and enter into the uterus. They'll then hatch out and produce a hormone called estrogen sulfate. So this hormone that's produced by the embryos signals to the sow that I'm here, I want to implant and have a pregnancy. So you need a minimum of 5 embryos doing that for the pregnancy to progress. There is some research that suggests less, but the general rule of thumb is 5. And then at day 14 to 17, the embryos implant. And during that implantation phase, they release the estrogen sulfate again, which tells the sow, yes, we're going to have a pregnancy here. So then that will indicate back to the ovaries where we have our corpus luteum structure to continue producing progesterone, which is our pregnancy hormone to maintain the pregnancy. And then at day 35, bone is formed in the fetus. So those two signaling patterns are important to understand with respect to return to estrus patterns. So if we think about the sow cycle, she comes into heat every 21, or she ovulates every 21 days. So if we have a service, so we mate her, and we don't get the day 10 signal of estrogen sulfate, so maybe we only have 3 embryos, so therefore the pregnancy isn't viable. That means that she will return to heat in 21 days. So she'll go through a normal cycle like she was never pregnant. If, on the other hand, we get the first signal, but then whatever reason the embryos don't implant and we lose the pregnancy, then that means that she will return not at 21 days, but a little bit after, day 25 to 35, and that's called a irregular return. So we have to be mindful when we're checking our sows for successful pregnancies that you can get regular returns, which are at day 21, and you can get irregular returns at day 25, 35. Another possibility is a return at day 42. Have a think in over a few seconds what that could be. It really is that she returned at day 21, but you missed it, and now she's returned at day 42, which is her second cycle after the missed one. Okay, so is she pregnant? How do we know if our females are pregnant on farm? So one way to do it is to do heat detection with the bore or the back pressure test 21 days after mating, because if she comes back into heat, that obviously means she's not pregnant. From 21 days, you can also use an ultrasound scanner on the farm. So often people who work in the gestation housing and the farrowing house will be trained in how to use the ultrasound scanner, and these are the kind of images that you'll see. So this is a pregnant sow, so you can see the the amniotic fluid around the embryos. It's kind of hard to see the embryos, but you can see the fluid. This on the far right is a non-pregnant sow, so we're just looking at intestine here. This is a pregnant sow, and we're actually looking at bone. So that's the spine, and that's the rib cage of a piglet. So yes, so in addition to using the ultrasound scanner, we also have to do heat detection, not only at 21 days, but maybe during that 4th week as well, to pick up any irregular returns. And we also we can use a Doppler machine. So a Doppler machine will measure increased blood flow to the uterus, and we can usually do that from about 28 days. By 8 weeks, we should be able to see by looking at a sow that she's pregnant. So a common scenario for a lot of farms is that they will mate their sows, put the sows into sow stalls to keep them nice and stress-free for that critical phase when the pregnancy is establishing. Then at 21 days, they'll bring a boar past her, see if she shows any signs of being in heat. The next week, they might bring a boar past her just to see if she's an irregular return. And then they might run an ultrasound over her to see if they can see evidence of a pregnancy. Once a pregnancy is confirmed, then that is when she's moved into group housing. So usually after that 5th to 6th week when she'll go into group housing. And we've already talked about gestation housing for the sows. So we've got our stalls for a maximum of 6 weeks, and then our group housing in sheds or in shelters with straw. Okay, so just a word on parity distribution. So parity distribution is really important for the reproductive success of your herd in terms of your production efficiency. So this is an example of a good parity distribution in a herd. So remember I said we want our gilts to be around 20%, and then our sows 80%. Our parities 3, 4, 5, and 6 are our best producers in terms of how many eggs they ovulate, and also they've got good mammary development, so they're really good at supporting their piglets through lactation. So you want your herd, 50% of your herd to be in this parity category here. You will have some older girls who have been really good, but you obviously don't want too many, and I'll talk about that in a sec. This is an example of a poor parity distribution. So what has happened here is that for some reason we've had to cull a lot of sows out of these critical parities, 3 to 6. Maybe we had an issue with aggression and a lot of lameness, so we lost a lot of sows through that, or there was reproductive disease, who knows. But what has happened is they've held on to more older girls than they should have, and then they've had to increase their uptake or their replacement rate of gilts. So remember, gilts are quite poor performers, so that's going to bring down our overall production in terms of piglets weaned per mated sow per year. And the older girls we'll talk about just here. So what happens with older girls is that while their total born is pretty good, their born alive goes down. So because the uterus has been used multiple times, it's quite big and flaccid, so therefore it can take longer for piglets to get down the reproductive tract during the birthing process, and if that takes too long, then they can be oxygen deprived and come out as a stillbirth. So because the uterus is very stretched, it doesn't contract as nicely as it should, so therefore it's harder to get the piglets out. And also the sows tend to be bigger and fatter and a bit lazier, so you increase your risk of overlays as well as the sows get older. With our young girls, it can be a bit of a stressful process for them, and sometimes you can see piglets savaging as well. Okay, so this is just a word on summer infertility. So as I said before, pigs are cold climate animals. So trying to raise them in Australia can certainly have its challenges, particularly over summer. And what can happen when we get hot temperatures is that it can have an effect on sow feed intake, which has an effect on milk production and piglet performance. It can also have an effect on follicle development. So if we're not getting the appropriate nutrition into our sows, it will reduce the expression of reproductive hormones and follicle development, which will reduce our litter size and increase our wean to service interval. Also, hot temperatures can reduce semen production in boars. And it can also have an effect on embryo development. So they say that if you get extreme temperatures when a sow is pregnant in either very early or very late pregnancy, that can have an effect on the piglets. So that can change their feed efficiency and also their expression of back fat depth. So interesting findings there. So this is just a bit of a summary page, I guess, to bring you back to that first lecture where we talked about improving our breeder productivity, which is around reducing our total fixed costs on farm by selling more pigs. So it would be a useful exercise, particularly we've just spoken about reproduction, to go back and think about the different factors that will affect these sorts of factors. So for example, talking about season and hot weather, that's going to affect our pre-weaning mortality because it affects sow feed intake and therefore milk production. So therefore our piglets aren't thriving as well as they could be potentially. And it also, hot weather affects follicle development. So then that's going to have an impact on our total born. If we think about parity distribution and we get our parity distribution wrong on farm, that's going to affect our born alive, because if we have a lot of older sows, there's a higher risk of stillbirths, which brings down our born alive. It'll affect our total born, because if we have a lot of young gilts, then they're not going to ovulate as many eggs, so therefore our litter sizes are reduced. Parity distribution will affect pre-weaning mortality. If we have a lot of older girls, we tend to get more overlays, and also potentially it can affect our non-productive days. So thinking about our gilts, they might have a longer estrus to service interval. So if we've got more gilts in our breeder herd, then that's going to increase this average value as well. In terms of housing, if we're going to house our sows, our lactating sows in farrowing pens or farrowing huts or in group lactation, then that can have an effect on pre-weaning mortality. Depending on how we mix our groups of pregnant sows, that can have an effect on total born and born alive in terms of the stress that happens in that critical point when pregnancy is establishing. And it could also affect our pre-weaning mortality. So remember, if a sow experiences stress in the fourth, fifth or sixth weeks of pregnancy, then research has shown that can have an effect on the progeny in terms of their feed efficiency, susceptibility to stress and disease, etc. So a good idea just to review this lecture, thinking about it from this slide's point of view, if that makes sense. Okay, so I've managed to get us back in line on time with regard to the lectures. So next lecture we'll do our sows and piglets, and I'll stay online for the next few minutes if anyone has any questions. So thanks for turning up on Monday morning, always a tricky one, and I apologise I was a bit late to the first session. Thanks, guys.